Here's a chilling fact. Medieval peasants spent up to 60% of their winter nights awake. Not by choice, but because the cold, the hunger, and the sheer discomfort made sleep nearly impossible. Tonight, we're uncovering the raw, unromanticized ways they filled those endless hours between dusk and dawn. You're huddled in a thatched-roof cottage as the wind howls through gaps in the walls. The fire sputters, barely denting the cold. Every movement makes the straw beneath you rustle with fleas. Outside, wolves howl. This isn't a cozy winter evening. It's a nightly battle for survival. Your breath fogs in the air as you count the hours until dawn, knowing sleep won't come easily tonight. Picture this. You're sitting so close to the fire that your face burns while your back stays numb from cold. The hearth isn't cozy. It's a tactical operation. Every night, families arrange themselves like spokes on a wheel around this smoky pit, with the strongest adults closest to the flames and the elderly tucked in the slightly warmer corners. Children and the sick, they got whatever scraps of heat trickled down from the bodies around them. Those drafty medieval huts lost heat faster than you'd believe. Even stone cottaras had gaps between logs wide enough to fit your thumb through, letting in icy fingers of wind all night. Some families stuffed the cracks with mud and straw, but that just meant swapping cold air for the stench of damp earth. The real trick was banking the embers, covering them with ashes just right so they'd last till morning without wasting precious fuel. Get it wrong, and you'd either wake to a dead fire or a pile of smoldering ashes where your house used to be. Records show at least 3 cases in 14th century England where entire families died because someone rolled too close to the fire in their sleep. Their wool clothing, drenched in sweat and grease after months without washing, would sometimes catch spark without anyone noticing until the smell of burning flesh cut through the smoke. The placement of your sleeping spot near the hearth wasn't just about comfort. It was a survival hierarchy. The head of household always got the prime real estate by the flames, servants and farm hands. They slept near the door where the cold pooled like water. Some lords actually charged peasants rent based on how close their beds were to fireplace. 2 chickens per season bought you about 3 feet of warmth. And forget about romantic candlelight. Those tallow candles you see in movies cost more than most peasants earned in a week. The flickering fire was your only light source, which meant everything happened in this eerie half-darkness. Cooking, sewing, even surgery, all conducted in the same dim orange glow that made every shadow look hungry. The smoke didn't just sting your eyes, it damaged them. Chronic eye infections were standard among medieval peasants, with many going partially blind by middle age from years of squinting through haze. Those fancy smoke hoods you see in reenactments, only the wealthy could afford chimney pipes. For everyone else, the smoke just lingered at head height until it found its way out through the thatch. Some nights the choice was simple: breathe or stay warm. Families with sick members often chose warmth, leading to accounts of whole households found dead come morning, not from the cold, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. Their faces would be strangely peaceful, like they'd just drifted off mid-conversation against the hearthstones. The hearth didn't just divide families, it divided villages. Wealthier homes had proper chimneys that actually drew smoke upward, while poorer neighbors choked on the fumes. This created literal circles of survival where the closer you lived to the manor house, the better your chances. Some manor records show peasants paying extra tithes just to borrow chimney heat from the lord's outer kitchens. By midnight, the fire would dwindle to glowing coals, and that's when the real test began. Do you add another log from your dwindling pile, risking starvation later when there's no fuel left. Or tough it out, knowing the coldest hours before dawn could freeze the water bucket solid, or your youngest child's fingers. Most chose to suffer through, blowing on their hands and trading shifts to keep watch over the dying embers until first light. And if you thought the fire brought safety, think again. That same glow making shadow puppets on your walls also signaled your location to every scavenger within miles, both the four-legged and two-legged varieties. That pile of firewood in the corner wasn't just fuel, it was your family's lifeline, counted stick by stick like gold coins. Most peasants didn't own their fuel sources. Every fallen branch within walking distance belonged to the local lord, and taking even a dead twig could land you in the stocks. Forest rangers patrolled with iron shackles ready, and court records show poachers losing fingers for stealing armloads of kindling. Winter morning started before dawn with the sound of axes ringing through frozen air, not chopping trees, but hacking at the same stump everyone had been gnawing at since autumn. Kids as young as 5 got sent out with baskets to scour the ground for pinecones, acorns, anything that might catch flame. Some villages had twig taxes, where children had to deliver daily bundles to the manor just to prove they hadn't stolen from the lord's forest. When decent wood ran out, people burned whatever didn't move. Dried cow dung was the best-case scenario. It at least held a steady heat. The truly desperate burned roof thatch, fence posts, even the wooden soles of their shoes. A 1387 ledger from Yorkshire lists a widow's conviction for burning her deceased husband's tools, salvaging the nails afterward to trade for meal. The black market for fuel never slept. Night watchmen often turned blind eyes to bundled faggots slipping between cottages for the right bribe, usually a share of the haul. Underground wood banks operated on credit systems. Take 3 logs tonight, repay 5 after next harvest. Failure meant your name got added to the village debt board, where everyone knew exactly who'd be freezing come January. Fuel scarcity reshaped sleep itself. Families took turns staying awake to feed the fire in precise intervals. 2 logs every 3 hours, no more. Some communities synchronized their burn schedules so the combined chimney smoke might confuse predators. Records from alpine villages describe heat sharing, packs where multiple families piled into one home at night, pooling their wood reserves while the other houses went dark and freezing. You learned to judge a neighbor's wealth by their nighttime smoke. Steady gray plumes meant seasoned oak burning clean. Those thin, erratic puffs, someone was rationing green wood or worse, boiling leather scraps for glue just to get 1 more calorie of warmth. The very poor burned damp moss that smoldered for hours without flame, filling homes with eye-watering haze. Entire villages stank like wet campfires all winter. Desperation bred innovation. Masonry ovens doubled as sleeping platforms after baking day. Families buried heated stones in bedding straw, though many woke with burns where the rocks had shifted. Some stuffed clothing with dried marsh grass for insulation, despite the itching and the mice it attracted. The earliest surviving German bed warmer, a perforated tin box full of coals that probably caused more barn fires than comfort. When the last stick was gone, people burned their futures. A 14th century French inventory lists a peasant household's possessions in February. 1 table, 2 chairs, a chest. The April follow-up shows just the chest. Everything else had fed the hearth. Some stripped their own roof beams, gambling they could replace them before spring rains. Court cases reveal tenants secretly dismantling rental properties for fuel, then hastily rebuilding come thaw. The cruelest nights came during January thaws. Warmer air tricked you into burning less, only for temperatures to plummet after midnight. That's when the furniture went into the fire. Parish records from Norway describe villagers burning sledges and fishing nets, tools they'd need desperately come spring, just to survive till dawn. And if you think that sounds bad, wait until you hear what happened when the flames finally died. Darkness wasn't just empty space to these people. It was an active, crawling threat that changed how they saw the world itself. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a predator that stalked medieval villages every winter night. Without street lamps or even reliable candles, that inky blackness pressed against your skin like a physical weight. Peasants didn't just fear the dark, they expected it to hurt them. Wolf attacks weren't rare. French church records list 17 children killed by wolves near Paris in the winter of 1438 alone, most snatched from doorways where they'd been sent to fetch firewood. The locks on peasant doors were laughable by modern standards, just wooden bolts or iron hooks that any determined thief could shake loose. Some nailed animal skins over door gaps, not for insulation, but because the hair would catch on intruders' clothing. Wealthier families used witch boards, planks carved with crosses or prayers that were more about superstition than security. Windows didn't have glass. They had shutters that warped in the cold, leaving finger-width gaps where threats could watch you sleep. Moonlight mattered more than clocks. On bright nights, villagers squeezed in extra work, mending tools, spinning wool, anything too dangerous to do by firelight alone. New moons meant lockdown. A Sussex coroner's roll mentions a tanner who broke curfew during a moonless night and drowned in a ditch he'd walked past daily for years. Travelers. They either paid to stay in guarded inns or risked becoming the subject of someone else's cautionary tale. The night watchman's call was the village heartbeat after dark. Every hour his voice cut through the cold. All's well. Though everyone knew it often wasn't. His lantern was the only moving light for miles, bobbing past homes where families lay tense beneath their blankets. In Bavaria, watchmen carried noisemakers filled with pebbles to rattle if they spotted danger. Problem was, by the time you heard those stones shaking, whatever they'd seen was already at your doorstep. Roads after dusk were death traps. Frozen ruts snapped wagon axles, leaving merchants stranded until morning, if they lived that long. A 1391 merchant's diary describes finding 3 frozen bodies along a half-mile stretch of road, their fingers still clutching the coins they'd hoped would buy shelter. Bandits didn't even need weapons. They could just follow the sound of chattering teeth. The psychological toll was worse than the cold. Parents taught kids to associate darkness with teeth and claws. Bedtime stories weren't whimsical. They were warnings packaged as tales. Norwegian folktales spoke of the utbird, spirits of abandoned babies who returned to scratch at doors. German hearth legends described the Butzemann, a shadow that stole children who wandered too far from the fire. Fear wasn't incidental, it was the point. You slept armed, a sickle under the straw mattress, an axe handle within reach. Burglars weren't the worst threat, starving neighbors were. In hard winters, villages near the Alps reported flower raids, where desperate families would storm pantries at night. Basque shepherds took shifts guarding sheepfolds with spears, not from wolves but from other shepherds. The sounds of the night weren't foxes or wind, they were potential murderers. That creak wasn't just your house settling. It was someone testing your door latch. A 15th century doctor's journal describes patients who couldn't sleep without a hand wrapped around a blade, their fingers permanently cramped from clutching weapons night after night. Insomnia wasn't a medical condition. It was common sense. Some towns tried organized protection. In Normandy, fishermen would tie ropes between houses so night patrols could follow them in blizzards. Swiss villages stationed boys with slingshots on rooftops to pelt wolves. But mostly, you relied on the same dirty secret everyone did. Hope that danger would pick someone else's house tonight. By midnight, even the watchman's voice faded. That's when you heard the real night sounds, the scuttling of rats in the thatch, the groan of frost squeezing your door frame, the wet cough of a sick child in the next bed. Dawn was hours away, and every snapping twig outside carried the same unspoken question. Is this the sound that means we don't live till morning? The irony. That gnawing terror kept you awake more than any cold. And being awake meant you noticed every ominous rustle, every distant howl. Villagers didn't just lose sleep to discomfort. They lost it to the sheer mental labor of interpreting every shadow. Which might explain why peasant beds were often found with strangest remnants clutched in stiff fingers. Not just tools, but charms, crosses, sometimes just fistfuls of straw grasped like weapons against the dark. They knew what we've forgotten. Night wasn't empty. It was hungry. And when the danger wasn't teeth or knives, it was flesh and blood. People packed into those cramped huts didn't just share warmth. They shared every itch, every cough, every secret they'd rather have kept to themselves. The bed itself became a battleground. That straw-filled sack on the floor isn't a bed. It's a communal survival pod. Medieval peasants didn't just share beds with immediate family. They crammed in visiting relatives, farmhands, even livestock when the temperature dropped. The average peasant household slept 5 to a mattress, with servants lining up on the dirt floor like firewood. You didn't get a pillow. Pillows were luxuries reserved for childbirth and the dying. Sleeping positions followed strict hierarchy. The head of household got the wall side, not for comfort, but because exterior walls oozed freezing dampness all night. Children were stuffed into the middle like human insulation. Elderly relatives drew the short straw, literally. They often got the bed's foot where everyone's icy toes converged. Travelers paying for lodging. They got the edge, where one restless sleeper could send you tumbling onto the packed earth floor. That mattress wasn't just shared, it was recycled. When the straw inside turned to dust and flea habitat, you didn't replace it. You turned it, rotating sections so the least compacted parts took the weight. Some households marked mattress quadrants with chalk, methodically working through each sector like crop rotation. The really poor used dried ferns that crackled like firecrackers with every movement. Wealthier peasants might have wool-stuffed ticks, which just meant the fleas were warmer. Blanket negotiations happened nightly. A single heavy cover draped over the group, with constant tug-of-war over who got what section. Wool blankets absorbed sweat, grease, and worse. After months of use, they stiffened like cardboard near the shoulder areas. Nighttime theft was common. Wake up cold, and you'd often find your teenager had snake-hipped the good blanket corner right off you. Parish records from York mention a man fined for stealing his neighbor's cover during a night visit. He'd apparently swapped it with his thinner one. The sounds alone prevented rest. Between coughs, snores, and the rustle of flea bites being scratched, sleep came in fragments. Infant wails echoed off the bare walls since no one had separate nurseries. Some parents tied bells to cradle cloths so they'd hear if a child stopped breathing, an early form of baby monitor with disastrous false alarms. The really sick were often propped upright against the wall to prevent choking fits, their ragged breathing keeping the whole house awake. You couldn't escape bodily revelations. Everyone knew who had gas after eating bad beans. Everyone heard the marital bed creaking 2 feet away. Children learned about sex not through the talk, but through nightly audio commentary. The concept of private bodily functions didn't exist. If you needed the chamber pot at 3 a.m., 15 people heard it. German household inventories list privacy screens that were just old grain sacks hung from rafters. They blocked nothing. The flea situation defied belief. Wooden bed frames had carved flea, trenches filled with animal fat to lure and drown the pests. People wore linen nightshirts not for modesty, but because tight-woven fabric slowed the bug's progress. Some stuffed mattress seams with wormwood or mint, though this mainly created herb-scented fleas. The worst infestations led households to drag beds into winter streams, freezing the bugs out, and often giving everyone pneumonia in the process. Extended families turned sleep into social engineering. Unmarried sisters shared beds to prevent straying. Elders slept between young couples as chaperones. In alpine villages, betrothed pairs were sometimes forced to share beds with swords between them, a tradition that produced remarkably few accidents but lots of creative solutions. Servants caught stealing blanket share could find themselves demoted to sleeping with the pigs. Bedmates shaped personalities. The youngest kid always developed lightning-fast reflexes from dodging elbows. Middle children became expert negotiators from years of bargaining for blanket real estate. And everyone mastered the art of pretending to be asleep when chores were being assigned at dawn. You didn't just overhear family secrets. You absorbed them through your skin during those endless winter nights pressed shoulder to shivering shoulder. The real education happened after dark. Children learned which uncle drank too much by his slurred midnight ramblings. Wives discovered whose husband was cheating when he muttered the wrong name in his sleep. Families didn't air their dirty laundry. They slept in it. Court records reveal countless disputes that began with, "He admitted it while we were all in bed." By adulthood, you knew 2 things exhaustively: how to survive extreme discomfort and exactly how many coins your father hid under the floorboard near the hearth. Privacy wasn't violated. It simply hadn't been invented yet. And just when you thought the coughing and scratching couldn't get worse, the real nighttime symphony began, the clatter of tools being repaired by flickering firelight. That flickering hearth light didn't just keep you warm, it was your factory floor. After sundown, peasants transformed cramped living spaces into workshops, hands moving by muscle memory in the dim orange glow. Men repaired plowshares using stones heated in the embers, hammering out dents while women darned fishing nets with bone needles. Every snapped tool meant hungry months ahead, so splintered axe handles got bound with wet leather that shrank tight as it dried. Spinning wool became a nighttime marathon. Women worked drop spindles in darkness, fingers judging thread thickness by touch alone. The best spinners could produce yarn blindfolded, which was handy since the firelight barely reached their laps. Flax spinning was worse. Those fibers splintered into fingertips, leaving hands raw. Some households kept rotten apples nearby. The acid helped soften the fibers, but the smell mixed with wood smoke created a stomach-churning perfume. Blade maintenance sounded like nighttime music. The rhythmic scrape of whetstones on scythes formed a metallic lullaby, punctuated by the occasional hiss of hot metal dipped in urine, the medieval equivalent of quenching oil. Farmers tested edges on arm hair, the flickering light making every stroke a gamble. German guild records list 17 blade-related injuries from after-dark sharpening in a single winter. Leatherwork turned brutal without proper light. Cobblers punching holes for stitches often missed and stabbed their thighs. Belt makers trimmed edges by feel, sometimes taking fingertips with the excess hide. Tanners softened stiff hides by chewing them, a job usually given to children with strong teeth. The damp animal skins left a greasy film on everything, making tools slippery in already hazardous conditions. Children's hands proved perfect for delicate tasks. Small fingers reknotted broken fishing nets or sorted seed grains by touch. Fathers taught sons to carve replacement tool handles through demonstration, placing the boys' hands over theirs to feel each corrective motion. Apprenticeships happened nightly. If you couldn't master a knot blindfolded by age 10, you'd never earn full wages. The most valuable nighttime product: rope. Villagers twisted straw, hemp, even hair into cordage that would fetch good trade come spring. The process required steady tension, so someone always had strands wrapped around their back teeth as an anchor. Dental records show distinctive wear patterns from years of this. Medieval orthodontists called it rope mouth. Pottery repairs happened near the fire's edge. Broken crockery got drilled with tiny holes and stitched together with wire, a technique called riveting that left vessels leaking but functional. Glazes were impossible in the dark, so these patch jobs stood out like scars. Modern archaeologists can spot winter-repaired pottery by its lopsided stitching. Textile production never stopped. Looms dominated corner spaces, their heavy frames casting spiderweb shadows. Weavers memorized complex patterns through counting systems. A mistake meant unraveling hours of work. Some kept tally marks on their own arms with charcoal, washing them off at dawn. The poorest households unraveled old clothes to reuse yarn, picking apart seams with frozen fingers. Basket weaving turned hazardous without light. Willow shoots snapped unpredictably, whipping across faces. Many wintertime eye injuries came from stray splinters during late-night basket work. Some villages had dedicated menders, people who did nothing but repair other villagers' damaged baskets through the coldest months. Metalwork was a risky after-dark endeavor. Families lucky enough to own a small anvil would repair tools using the hearth's edge as a forge. The glow wasn't bright enough to judge metal colors properly, so smiths tested temperature by spitting on surfaces. The sizzle told them when to strike. More than one cottage burned down when hot metal rolled into the straw flooring. The noise never ceased. Between the hammering, scraping, and muttered curses, these nighttime work sessions sounded more like workshops than homes. Chronic sleep deprivation meant tempers flared over dropped tools or botched stitches. Court records show winter months produced more domestic violence cases, often triggered by arguments over ruined handicrafts. Morning revealed the toll. Blood speckled the floor from nicks and cuts. Half-finished tools lay abandoned where exhausted workers collapsed mid-task. But stacked against the walls were the season's lifelines: repaired plows, resewn sacks, sharpened blades, all produced through hundreds of hazardous nighttime hours. These weren't hobbies. They were the difference between eating and starving come spring. And when fingers were too stiff to work another stitch, that's when the stories started, not for entertainment but as another survival tool sharpened in the dark. The stories told around winter fires weren't just entertainment. They were survival manuals disguised as folklore. Every tale about witches stealing children or spirits lurking in snowdrifts served a practical purpose. Parents didn't have the luxury of scaring kids for fun. They needed them to fear wandering too far from the hearth when temperatures dropped. Winter spirits dominated these stories across Europe. German peasants spoke of Frau Hall, who made it snow when she shook out her feather beds, a clever way to explain blizzards while warning against leaving home during storms. Slavic villages told of the Morozko, a frost demon who froze disobedient children solid. These weren't fantasy creatures but personified winter threats. When a Scottish parent described the Nukkalavi, a skinless horse demon that rode icy winds, they were really saying stay inside during storms. Mothers wove practical lessons into the scariest tales. A common English story featured Jack Frost luring children onto frozen ponds with pretty ice patterns, right before the ice cracked. The Welsh had BWCI Bow, a fire-dwelling imp that burned kids who got too close to flames. Each story came with visual aids. Parents would hold up a scorched shoe or point to the pond where the miller's boy drowned last winter. Elders mastered the art of timing their tales to the environment. The best storytellers paused when wind rattled the shutters, letting nature amplify their words. A Norwegian saga describes an old woman who'd stop mid-sentence when owls screeched outside, then whisper, "That's the sound the lost boy heard." Voices dropped to murmurs during key warnings, forcing children to lean closer to the fire, exactly where adults wanted them. Some stories were considered too dangerous for daylight. Breton peasants believed speaking of the Anku, a skeletal figure who collected frozen souls, after sunset would summon him. These tales were only told at dusk inside protective circles of salt. Similarly, alpine communities banned talk of avalanche spirits once full dark fell, fearing the stories might attract disaster. The clergy recorded fragments of these oral traditions, often missing the point entirely. A 14th century monk wrote of French peasants telling superstitious nonsense about winter witches. What he dismissed as folklore was actually fire safety advice. The witches represented dangerous ember-spreading habits. Other church scribes noted tales of demonic wolves that walked like men, likely warnings about starvation-driven wolf attacks on moonless nights. Horror served a psychological function. In Essex villages, parents described the window watcher, a creature with frostbite-blackened fingers that tapped on glass. This kept kids from sleeping near drafty windows where hypothermia risk was highest. Similarly, Swedish stories of the Yule cat that ate poorly clothed children encouraged families to keep mending winter garments after dark. The scarier the monster, the more effective the lesson. No peasant bothered with tame warnings. Repetition hardened these fears into instinct. Children didn't just hear about the ice-tongue spirit that froze tongues to metal. They practiced spitting on cold door latches to demonstrate the danger. In Czech villages, teens played games where touching the cottage walls after dark meant the frost demons got you. These oral traditions created generations who associated nighttime cold with genuine existential threats. The storytelling style itself was tactical. Elders used rhymed couplets for important warnings because rhyme aids memory even in exhausted minds. Lists of rules, never follow the blue light, never touch the silver frost, mirrored the structure of modern safety briefings. Call-and-response techniques ensured kids were awake and attentive. If they missed answering who guards the fire, they got splashed with cold water. Some tales blurred with reality intentionally. When a Kentish grandmother described her cousin who slept walk-in into the snow never to wake, she might have been recounting an actual incident. This practice gave stories credibility that pure fiction lacked. Welsh families kept relics of tragedies, a frozen mitten, a lightning-charged spoon, as storytelling props to drive points home. The stories adapted to local dangers. Coastal villages had drowning tales, mountain communities warned of avalanche spirits, and towns near forests invented predators lurking just beyond the firelight. Archaeologists find these regional differences preserved in children's graves, kids buried with protective amulets matching current local folklore threats. Fear wasn't the only tool. Rewards featured in stories too. The Russian Father Frost gave gifts to kids who conserved firewood. Clever parents balanced tales of terrifying snow maidens with accounts of the hearth mother who blessed families keeping good fires. This carrot and stick approach made lessons stick better than raw terror alone. These oral traditions died hard for good reason. When the Black Death wiped out knowledgeable elders, some villages saw spikes in winter accidents, proof the stories worked. A French monk's diary from 1350 notes increased frozen corpses found near woods, observing, "The fools lacked someone to scare them properly." By February, the repetition reached religious intensity. Children could recite winter dangers backward, but still listened intently, because everyone knew the family down the lane lost a son last winter when he forgot the rules. Storytelling became its own nightly chore, as essential as banking the fire. And after the last tale faded, another sound took its place, the hollow growl of empty stomachs. That empty feeling in your gut wasn't just hunger, it was a calculation. Every bite withheld tonight meant another scrap for tomorrow's work. The evening meal wasn't about satisfaction. It was calorie budgeting stretched thinner than the last winter turnip in the pot. Families developed strict routines around the cooking pot. Come nightfall, grain that should have simmered for hours would go into a cauldron suspended just above the embers. This wasn't cooking, it was slow starvation delayed. The pottage thickened overnight into gluey masses speckled with whatever protein scraps remained. Dried peas, strips of leathery salt pork, perhaps a squirrel caught weeks prior. You didn't eat this mess before bed. You endured its taunting smell knowing it was tomorrow's breakfast if the fire didn't die. Cooking after dark was risky business. The scent of even meager meals carried through frozen air, attracting wolves that paced beyond the faint firelight. Thieves followed smells too. Lincolnshire court records show multiple cases of armed men storming cottages over bubbling pot odors. Smart families cooked before sunset, then transferred pots to cooling spots where the food wouldn't spoil but wouldn't broadcast their meager supplies either. Leftovers didn't exist in winter. A single pot of barley gruel might be stretched across 3 days by adding progressively more water and sawdust like bran. French peasants called this pain fantôme, ghost bread, because you could see right through the broth to the bottom of the bowl. Each reheating evaporated more nutrients until you were essentially drinking lukewarm grain-flavored water with a film of grease on top. Taste wasn't the point. By midwinter, ingredients dwindled to whatever mold hadn't yet claimed. Welsh probate records list pantries containing nothing but 3 withered parsnips and a bladder of rancid suet. Families got creative, boiling pine needles for vitamin C, soaking oak acorns to remove their bitterness, rendering candle wax into thickening agents. One Yorkshire woman's diary describes a February meal as peas porridge with more ash than pea. The rationing systems were brutal but precise. In Slavic villages, the eldest got first pick of scraps for their wisdom, while the strongest workers took larger portions for tomorrow's labor. Children received set amounts based on height, hand spans measured against walking staffs marked with notches. Scottish Highland families tied colored strings around loaves, red for Monday, blue for Tuesday, cutting precisely to those lines regardless of hunger pangs. Midnight hunger woke you sharper than any nightmare. Stomach acid gurgled loud enough to draw glances from shared bedding. Some sucked on strips of bark to trick their guts into silence. Others drank sleep broth, water boiled with a single shriveled herb that tasted like dirt, but at least warmed the belly for an hour. English court physic records show a surge in hunger convulsions. Come February, violent abdominal spasms from empty stomachs trying to digest themselves. The cold worked against preservation. Come dawn, many lifted pot lids to find their carefully hoarded meals frozen solid. Scandinavians had a saying, "The ice takes its share too." You could chip portions free to thaw by body heat, but each freeze-thaw cycle degraded what little nutrition remained. Some Baltic families buried pots beneath the hearth's ashes, not to keep them warm, but to keep them from freezing harder than granite. Starvation made people inventive and desperate. Derbyshire miners' wives soaked leather girdles in broth, then chewed them all night like grisly gum. Poaching happened, but the penalties were dire. One Nottinghamshire man lost his right hand for stealing a winter cabbage. The truly desperate resorted to clay bread, mixing flour with white dirt that swelled in bellies but caused blockages. Church registers from harsh winters show spikes in deaths attributed to grief, a euphemism for malnutrition's slow chokehold. Breakfast was a cruel joke. Dawn's first light meant reheating whatever gruel hadn't solidified overnight, now with extra water to stretch it further. French children called this manger à l'ombre, eating the shadow, because the meal disappeared before it touched your tongue. Still, you forced it down. That thin broth was all that stood between you and collapsing by midday. By January, the body adapted in disturbing ways. Digestion slowed to conserve energy. Hands shook less from hunger once muscles consumed themselves. People moved slower, talked less, thought about food constantly. Yet they woke each morning to do it all again, because winter wasn't finished with them yet. And just when the hunger became unbearable, something worse set in. The bone-deep exhaustion of nights spent shivering instead of sleeping. You never actually slept through a winter night in the Middle Ages. You just dozed in stretches between coughing fits and chilblain pain. The cold saw to that. Your body cycled through shallow, frantic sleep stages, never dipping into proper REM. Think of it as nature's cruel joke, exhausted enough to collapse, but too uncomfortable to rest. The science behind this is brutal. Core body temperature must drop to enter deep sleep, but medieval peasants hovered in the danger zone where shivering kept muscles tense. Your shoulders ached from curling into a fetal position all night. Your feet stayed numb despite being tucked under someone's thighs. The German physician Hieronymus Brunschwig wrote in 1497 of patients who slept like the half-dead, eyes shut but fists clenched. Villagers adapted with a patchwork of micronaps. Doze for 20 minutes when the fire was strong, wake to poke it back to life, repeat. Some developed the ability to sleep standing up near warm livestock. Breton fishermen could snatch 10-minute naps between tending smoking fish racks, just enough to take the edge off before another round of shivering. It wasn't rest, just delayed collapse. Waking brought its own torments. Open your eyes to find your eyebrows crusted with frost from exhaled moisture. Your joints creaked like unoiled hinges after hours of immobility. The worst was thatch hair, when damp straw roofing dripped icy water directly onto your face at dawn. Manorial records list arguments over sleeping positions that ended with hay forks through hands. The physical toll was hideous. Chronic sleep deprivation triggers cortisol spikes that weaken the immune system, handy during plague seasons. Lack of REM sleep impairs wound healing. A December cut might still fester come March. English coroner rolls show winter farming accidents involving men who fell upon their own scythes or walked into mill gears. all attributed to winter fatigue. Some symptoms read like medieval torture. Hunger sleep struck when malnourished bodies prioritized digestion over rest. You'd pass out mid-task, then wake disoriented. Smoke dreams brought hallucinations from oxygen-starved brains. A Sussex woman's diary describes waking convinced spiders were nesting in her mouth, just a classic case of sleep deprivation psychosis. The village economy ran on these half-dead workers. Lords didn't adjust winter labor quotas for exhaustion. If anything, they increased them. Wood had to be hauled, ice chopped, livestock walked to prevent freezing. Some estates employed winter watchers to jab workers awake with sticks. Church courts heard endless cases of peasants caught nosing in haystacks when they should have been plowing frozen fields. Children suffered worst. Growing bodies need deep sleep they never got. Archaeological digs show medieval kids' bones with stunted growth plates and teeth marked by horizontal stress lines. Parents tied rags around toddlers' waists to keep them from sleepwalking into snowdrifts, a common cause of under 12 mortality. The rich weren't exempt. Castle bedrooms were often colder than peasant huts due to stone walls. Nobles slept in fur-lined boxes resembling coffins, their breath freezing on the canopy above. One French duke employed a servant solely to watch for the death stillness in sleepers, that moment when exhaustion crossed into fatal hypothermia. By February, entire villages moved like ghosts. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence as brains forgot thoughts. People chewed absent-mindedly on their own scarves. A Canterbury chronicler describes townsfolk with perpetually bloodshot eyes as ruddy as winter apples. The few surviving personal diaries from this era show handwriting deteriorating into illegible scrawls by late winter, hands shaking from months of exhaustion. Some crossed into hallucinations. A Yorkshire shepherd's will mentions leaving land to the blue woman who brought me warmth, likely a sleep deprivation phantom. More tragically, exhausted parents sometimes rolled onto infants in shared beds, later claiming the night spirits took them. No one questioned these stories. They'd all seen things in the long darkness. The church capitalized on this. Priests claimed visions of saints were signs of favor, not brain misfires. Monasteries sold vigil candles guaranteed to ward off sleep demons. They just contained trace amphetamines from contaminated tallow. When a plowman swore he saw the Virgin Mary in his freezing byre, the local abbey quietly installed a shrine and collected pilgrim fees. Your smartphone's sleep tracker would have short-circuited trying to log this mess. Segmented sleep. You were lucky to get consecutive 45-minute stretches. Light versus deep sleep. Everything was shallow. Sleep quality scores wouldn't even compute, yet somehow dawn always came. You'd blink at the gray light with gum-shut eyelids, knees popping as you stood, already dreading the next night's battle. And as you shuffled toward the frozen water bucket, you might whisper the same prayer villagers had uttered for centuries. Not for wealth or health, just for one solid hour of unconsciousness before the cold seeped back into your bones. That's when religion stopped being abstract and became as vital as firewood. When the last embers glowed faint red and your eyelids grew heavy, that's when the real work began, the praying. Not the quick mealtime blessings of summer, but the desperate, repetitive mantras to ward off everything the dark might bring. The church knew precisely how vulnerable you felt at night, which is why Compline, the final prayer service, was designed to echo through winter evenings like a spiritual security system. The prescribed nighttime prayers weren't gentle lullabies. They were verbal armor. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, wasn't poetic. It was literal begging for survival. Families huddled together reciting Psalm 91 about terror by night and the arrow that flies by day, substituting arrow with frostbite in their minds. The Welsh had a specific bedtime invocation. God between us and harm, repeated exactly 13 times, once for each hour until dawn. In Burgundy, peasants crossed their thumbs and whispered St. Benedict's anti-curse prayer before sleep, just in case. Rosary beads became more than devotional tools. They were the medieval version of counting sheep. Each, Our Father, marked about 2 minutes if recited slowly. 10 Hail Marys equaled 1 nighttime watch segment. Elders could estimate midnight by how many decades they'd prayed since sunset. Some families tied extra knots in their rosaries to track particularly long winter nights when time seemed to stretch unnaturally. The sounds of nighttime worship permeated every cottage. Latin phrases muttered under breath, the click-click-click of wooden beads, the occasional sob when someone missed a word and had to start over. In shared dwellings, prayers overlapped strangely. A wife chanting the litany of saints while her husband mumbled the 7 penitential psalms backward, a common folk magic practice. The combined effect was less holy harmony than spiritual white noise against the howling wind outside. Communities developed bizarre nighttime rituals. Some Yorkshire villages practiced barefoot shrining, walking to local chapels at midnight to touch relics with frost-numbed feet. Breton fishermen's wives circled their homes 3 times after dark, sprinkling salt and chanting. These weren't sanctioned by the church, but tolerated because who could prove they didn't help? In the Alps, entire families would crawl on frozen knees to hilltop crosses, believing the exertion kept their blood circulating through the coldest hours. The church maintained strict nighttime discipline. Missing Compline meant risking penance, perhaps an extra tithe of firewood or public reproof. Wealthy households hired priests to perform vigil checks, making sure servants weren't skipping prayers to sleep. Some monasteries installed candle clocks that burned exactly as long as required prayers should last. If the flame died before you finished, you owed extra devotions. Midnight held special terror. Many believed demons gained strength as the clock turned 12. German peasants spoke of the Wutend here, a phantom army that rode through villages at midnight stealing souls. The church cleverly co-opted these fears by declaring midnight the Christ hour, insisting proper prayer could turn the devil's peak power against him. This led to odd hybrid practices, like Bavarian families hanging horseshoes above their beds while simultaneously reciting Ave Marias. Priests weren't above scaremongering. Northern French parishes circulated night sin lists. Fail to say your bedtime prayers, and demons would note 7 additional sins against you before dawn. Italian confessional manuals instructed priests to ask specifically about nighttime irreligiosity during winter months. One Tuscan bishop mandated that homes keep blessed candles burning all night during December and January, conveniently supplied by church-approved chandlers at inflated prices. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Images of the Madonna of the Hearth showed the Virgin Mary literally blocking winter winds with her cloak, provided you'd said your prayers. Terrifying stories circulated of households wiped out by frost immediately after skipping evening devotions. Some Alpine churches kept frozen corpses in their porches as object lessons about spiritual slackness. Prayers bled into folk medicine. Breton mothers spat 3 times after nighttime blessings to seal them against winter fevers. Russian peasants hung carved crosses filled with salt and garlic, equally effective against vampires and chest colds. When the Black Death came, nighttime rituals grew even more elaborate, with families walking backward around their beds while reciting psalms before sleep. By February, exhaustion made devotion surreal. Half-asleep peasants slurred prayers into nonsense, their beads slipping through numb fingers. Some reported seeing the Virgin in the flames, others swore demons whispered through cracks in the walls. A priest in Norwich complained of parishioners praying to the fire itself during particularly brutal cold snaps. Yet the rituals worked, not miraculously, but practically. The repetitive motions kept hands from stiffening entirely. The focused breathing prevented full panic when the thatch creaked ominously. And the simple act of speaking aloud helped monitor for early signs of frostbite in children's slurred words. When every survival tool had been exhausted, the fire banked, the blankets shared, the last meager bites of supper consumed, prayer remained the one thing you could always do as the night wore on. That's why they called it the last resort. Meanwhile, outside the prayer-murmured walls, other signs needed reading. The stars hardening in the sky told their own story about what the coming days might bring. Your medieval ancestors didn't check smartphones for the time. They looked up. On crisp winter nights when clouds parted, the stars became their calendar, alarm clock, and weather forecaster combined. Forget poetic stargazing. This was survival astronomy at its most precise. Orion's belt didn't just twinkle prettily. When it hit a certain angle over the church steeple, you had exactly 14 dawns left to mend all your plow harnesses. Every culture had its celestial markers. English cottagers watched for the plow star, our Polaris to touch the roof line, that meant midnight and time to bank the fire again. Basque shepherds tracked the Pleiades' descent. When it kissed the western hills, the worst frosts were coming. German farmers called Sirius the winter eye. If it shone clear despite smoky hearth air, tomorrow's fieldwork began before dawn. These weren't suggestions. Families lived or starved based on these observations. The knowledge transfer was brutally practical. Grandfathers didn't point out constellations. They quizzed grandchildren sternly. Where's the haymaker's arrow? Wrong, that mistake costs us a week's plowing. In Normandy, teens had to draw star patterns in frozen mud with sticks before being allowed supper. Russian villages held star tests, where children named constellations while snowballs pelted them, simulating blizzard conditions. Smoke holes became primitive observatories. Elders would crane their necks through the ceiling's only opening, squinting past swirling hearth smoke to check critical stars. Welsh court records mention a murder trial where the defendant's alibi hinged on witnesses confirming he was at the hole watching the bear's turn when the deed occurred. Some cottages had notched door frames marking where specific stars should appear at key winter hours. Weather prediction relied on subtle cues modern eyes would miss. A halo around the moon didn't just mean rain. The thickness indicated how many days until storms hit. If the Milky Way shone unusually bright through thin high clouds, Scottish fishermen knew to expect savage waves within 36 hours. Certain star twinkling patterns signaled temperature drops. Rapid flickering meant sudden frosts were coming. The margin for error was non-existent. Misjudge Capella's position by a finger's width, and you'd start spring planting a week late, potentially missing the vital thaw window. One Swedish runestone records a family's starvation after the patriarch read the night ship backward. Cloudy stretches caused panics. Bavarian villages kept star recallers, elders who could visualize constellations from memory during overcast spells. Navigation wasn't just for travelers. On moonless nights when even outhouse trips risked deadly falls, families used stars shining through cracks in walls as guides. A Norwegian tale describes a widow who navigated her cottage solely by the loom shaft light, a star visible through a specific knothole above her loom. The rich had it easier. Monasteries sometimes possessed primitive astrolabes, but peasants developed their own tools. Lincolnshire fishermen used notched sticks to measure Orion's angle. French vineyard keepers stretched wool cords between trees to track Venus' movement. All improvised, all deadly serious. Your entire winter calorie reserve depended on accurate readings. Some beliefs straddled science and superstition. When the northern lights flared unusually bright, Baltic villages took it as a sign to slaughter extra livestock before hard freezes. We now know auroras correlate with solar activity that can precede cooling trends. Their superstition had observational basis. Similarly, the widespread belief that shooting stars predicted pestilence makes sense when you realize meteor showers often precede atmospheric changes affecting disease spread. The star knowledge seeped into language. English still uses dog days, from Sirius' ancient name, though few remember it originally marked the perilous stretch before harvest. The phrase star-crossed didn't mean doomed. It referred to missing critical planting deadlines. When Chaucer wrote of January's bull's eye, his audience knew exactly which star and which farming task he meant. Urbanization eroded this lore first. As towns grew smokier, fewer stars remained visible anyway. By the 1600s, London playwrights were already joking about city folk who couldn't find the North Star to save their lives, literally. But in remote areas, the traditions clung on stubbornly. Norwegian fishing villages were still using star-based weather prediction well into the 1900s. Today, we've lost the sharp urgency behind these practices. Your phone tells the time, satellites predict storms. But next cloudless winter night, try finding the Wintermaker constellation medieval Germans watched for Cassiopeia. Note how sharply its shape stands out in cold air. Then imagine your children's survival, depending on knowing it'll edge left another handsbreadth by tomorrow dawn. All this stargazing had a practical goal, keeping people alive until morning. But morning meant confronting another brutal truth. Your carefully saved drinking water had frozen solid overnight, and breaking that ice was just the first of the day's troubles. The water in your barrel could kill you just as easily as save you. That's the cruel paradox of winter hydration. The pure stuff froze solid, while contaminated sources stayed treacherously liquid. You'd wake to find your drinking water capped with inch-thick ice, while the tainted runoff near the midden steamed slightly in the cold, begging to be drunk. Breaking the ice was a dawn ritual that bruised hands and wore out tools. Families kept specialized implements just for this. Iron-tipped ice daggers, wooden mallets with spiked heads, even repurposed scythe blades. The well-off had copper scoops that conducted hand heat slightly, not enough to melt ice, but enough to weaken it for cracking. Communal wells sounded like distant gunshots at first light as multiple households attacked their frozen surfaces simultaneously. Miss your swing against the ice, and you'd smash your knuckles against the bucket rim instead. Medical records show winter spike fractures clustered around right-hand pointer fingers. Priority went to the most critical water first. Meltwater from clean snow got reserved for infants and the sick. Ice chips from the well's surface, less contaminated than lower layers, were for cooking. Anything from shallow ground pools, even if unfrozen, was strictly for livestock. You learned to judge safety by sound. Pure ice rang clear when struck, while ice with impurities made a dull thunk. Not that it mattered when thirst won out. Court cases reveal peasants drinking unmistakably foul water, then blaming witchcraft for their ensuing dysentery. The boiling choice was another calculation. Fuel was scarce, so you didn't sterilize all water, just enough for immediate needs. Some households used kettle chains, hanging multiple small pots at different heights over the fire to heat sequentially. Others dropped hot stones directly into water vessels, a risky move that often cracked the container. Scottish records mention families using their single cooking pot to both boil water and make breakfast, resulting in oat porridge flavored with whatever mineral residues the water carried. Night brought eerie sounds to water sources. Underground springs kept moving beneath frozen surfaces, creating ghostly gurgles at irregular intervals. Ice expanded unpredictably, sometimes groaning like a living thing. Welsh folklore spoke of well ghosts, whose moans were actually just these natural sounds amplified by frozen acoustics. Didn't stop anyone from hearing voices in the noise, though, especially after days of sleep deprivation. Disease outbreaks traced to winter water sources fill medieval records. A Norwich outbreak in 1382 was pinned on families collecting night water, melted snow left out after dark. Turns out the snow had absorbed chimney smoke and bird droppings all evening. In alpine villages, dysentery spiked whenever warm spells melted surface snow into runoff channels contaminated by animal carcasses. The sickest irony. Some purification methods made things worse. Adding ale to water, a common practice, actually fostered bacterial growth. The wealthy had marginal advantages. Monasteries could afford silver spoons to test water. Silver temporarily kills some bacteria. Nobles imported German ice nails, hollow spikes you drove into frozen streams to access cleaner water beneath. Everyone else relied on folk tests like floating bread crusts. If they sank too fast, the water was supposedly unsafe. Bread always sank eventually. Dehydration became its own danger. Nursing mothers suffered most. Milk production demands fluids, but contaminated water risked killing both mother and child. Some weaned babies dangerously early to avoid this trap. Workers avoided drinking to minimize nighttime bathroom trips, leading to kidney stones. A Lincolnshire farmer's journal describes passing a stone, like a barley grain with teeth. The desperate got creative. Icicles hanging from eaves became coveted prizes, despite containing roof thatch fibers. People sucked on clean snow like hard candy, until their lips cracked from the cold. Some chewed frozen moss that burned mouths but provided minimal moisture. Arctic Circle communities had it worst. Sea ice looks drinkable but causes salt poisoning. Sami herders taught children to identify specific yellowish ice patches that were marginally safer. Storage became psychological torment. That barrel in the corner wasn't just water. It was a constant reminder of your dwindling options. Stir it daily to prevent freezing completely. Lose precious heat from motion. Leave it still. Watch ice crystals form like slow strangulation. Some families slept with water vessels between bodies, trading warmth for minimal liquid retention. By February's end, many chose dehydration. A Bristol coroner's report lists a farmer dead from willful thirst after refusing to drink for 3 days despite available but suspect water. Others gambled wrong. Norwegian burial records show clusters of dysentery victims, all dating to late winter thaws, when stagnant water began flowing again. Water wasn't just a resource. It was a daily dilemma where every choice risked death by different flavors. Slow dehydration, fast disease, or the kidney-shredding middle ground. Small wonder people turned their attention to the only thing more complex than water management, the layered armor of clothing that stood between them and the cold. That wool tunic you've worn since November. It's not just dirty, it's literally part of your skin now, fused to your body by sweat, grease, and the sheer inability to ever take it off. Getting dressed for bed in winter wasn't about comfort. It was a military operation. You didn't change into night clothes. You reinforced the layers you'd worn all day with whatever scraps could trap body heat. That linen shirt you sweated in plowing fields, still on, the wool hose with the knee worn through, pulled up higher to cover your thighs. Your pajamas were just your day clothes plus desperation. Wool was the frontline defense, but it came with problems. Damp from daytime labor turned fibers clingy and cold against skin. A shirt worn 4 straight weeks could stiffen like cardboard from accumulated salt and grease. Scottish shepherds had a saying, "The best wool sticks," meaning it literally clung to your skin with dried sweat. The rich might own spare undergarments, but most peasants had one set worn continuously from first frost to spring thaw. The layering system worked like concentric armor. Start with the least itchy fabric against skin, maybe a linen shift if you were lucky. Then came the wool tunics, patched sleeves overlapping like roof shingles. Outer layers incorporated scavenged materials. Sacks stuffed with dried leaves tied around calves, woven reed panels inserted between shirts like crude insulation boards. Some Highland families wrapped children in sheepskins wool side in, secured with fraying rope belts. Straw became a key component, stuffed into sleeves, pants, even braided into crude chest wraps that crackled with every movement. Nighttime brought the rotation ritual. Family members shifted positions every few hours like meat on a spit, exposing a different side to the hearth's waning heat. Younger children got sandwiched between adults, their higher metabolism leveraged as miniature heating pads. Elderly relatives were positioned near the warmest bodies, though Breton records mention cases of grandparents accidentally kicking away blankets in dementia-fueled confusion. Everyone knew someone who'd lost toes to frostbite because their sleeping partner rolled away during the night. The smells defied modern comprehension. A single undergarment accumulated months of wood smoke, rancid tallow, fermented sweat, and the metallic tang of louse droppings. Alpine herders claimed they could identify neighbors by scent alone. The goatherd's family smelled faintly of curdled milk. The blacksmith's kin carried iron oxide's blood-like sting. People grew nose blind to their own stench, but recoiled at others. Church records show wintertime seating arrangements deliberately separated certain families. Frostbite cases followed predictable patterns. Fingers first, especially for those assigned fire-tending shifts who alternated between burning and freezing hands. Then toes, despite the rags wrapped around them. Worst were earlobes and nostrils, exposed during fitful sleep when blankets slipped. French medical texts describe treating blackened extremities with snow rubs, unaware this worsened tissue damage. Some villages had toe boards nailed to cottage walls, grooved planks where frostbitten feet could be strapped to prevent further injury during sleep. Women endured special hardships. Nursing mothers slept with infants against bare skin beneath all layers, risking chest frostbite to keep babies alive. Brides in Danube villages wore their wedding dresses all winter for extra insulation, the fabric growing stiff with months of grime. Widows fared worst. Many will mention gifts of winter shifts to unmarried female relatives who lacked spouses' body heat. The wealth gap showed in textile access. A prosperous farmer's family might have enough wool tunics to layer properly. The poor resorted to stuffing clothing with moss, feathers, even discarded parchment scraps. English coroner rolls list accidental deaths from quill prick fever, infections caused by makeshift parchment insulation piercing skin during sleep. Some Scandinavian families sewn live mice into their children's coats. The animal's body heat helped slightly, though most escaped by morning. Resourcefulness bordered on madness. An Essex farmer's diary describes repurposing his deceased wife's hair, weaving it into mittens for his daughter. Flemish fishermen wore specially knitted caps with extra-long ear flaps that could be tied under the chin and over the eyes like blindfolds, miniature sleeping bags for the head. Swiss Highlanders greased their skin with rancid butter before dressing, creating a crude vapor barrier. By midwinter, the clothing itself became hazardous. Layers chafed skin raw at the neck and wrists. Lice populations exploded in the warmest folds. One German medical text describes winter rash, open sores caused by months of friction against unwashed wool, but removing layers wasn't an option. Kentish court records show fines levied against paupers caught sleeping bare during cold snaps, considered a form of public disorder. The morning ritual was equally grim. Peeling apart sweat-fused layers of fabric often tore scabs open. Ice crystals would fall from hems when garments thawed by the fire. And somehow, you had to don this frozen stiff armor again for another day's labor. For children, the process was worse. Many learned to wiggle into frozen shoes by first stuffing them with live chickens. All this protection barely sufficed. Tax records from cold years show spikes in winter deaths, almost always accompanied by notes like "found with adequate clothing." Modern experiments recreating medieval winters prove what peasants knew instinctively. No amount of layering could fully compensate for sub-zero cottages. Yet they kept layering anyway, because the alternative was watching your breath slow until it stopped. And these were the challenges for adults. For children, winter's cruelty multiplied exponentially. Their small bodies lost heat faster, their fragile skin tore more easily, and survival often depended on skills learned before they could read. A medieval winter night didn't coddle children. It consumed the week before they could walk. While modern kids learn ABCs, peasant children mastered fire feeding by age 4. Their tiny hands were perfect for threading thin branches into the hearth without burning themselves, usually. Burgundy parish records list 32 cases of toddlers with fire scars in just one winter. Their parents fined for neglect while simultaneously being praised for early skills training. Infant mortality followed the cold like a shadow. Overcrowded beds meant smothering accidents happened weekly. Skeletal remains show many stillbirths were actually infants who died unnoticed in the night crush. Midwives taught mothers to check for breath by holding a feather near nostrils. If it didn't flutter, they quietly wrapped the tiny body before other children awoke. Swedish churches recorded winter baptisms held over open coffins for babies unlikely to see dawn. The chores started shockingly young. 4-year-olds gathered kindling in daylight, learning which mushrooms burned longest when dried. 5-year-olds stirred overnight porridge under supervision, their small arms less likely to knock over the precious pot. By 6, children were waking alone at intervals to tend fires, their sleep cycles permanently fractured. A Lincolnshire manor roll lists a 7-year-old fined for sleeping through watch, punished alongside adults for what we'd call a biological impossibility. Playtime doubled as survival training. Counting games involved naming edible versus poisonous roots. Hide and seek taught emergency shelter locations. French peasant rhymes like "Ring Around the Rosy" originally contained fire safety lyrics. The ashes referenced house fires from embers, not plague symptoms. Dolls were stuffed with herbs to repel bedbugs rather than for amusement. The sounds of sick children haunted winter nights. Whooping coughs ricocheted through rafters, sometimes triggering chain reactions where entire families would awaken hacking. Parents developed an ear for distinguishing tired coughs from dying coughs. Some Scottish villages hung sick children vertically in cradles, believing upright positions eased breathing, though it mainly just drained mucus toward their lungs faster. Monastery infirmary logs show winter admissions for children outnumbering summers 3-1. Fire was the cruelest teacher. Scandinavian folk tales speak of cold children, who could judge ember temperatures by cheek warmth, a real skill taught by holding hands closer each night until pain thresholds increased. German hearths often had learning burns, deliberate hot spots where toddlers touched once and never forgot. Welsh court records describe a 6-year-old tried for manslaughter after a younger sibling wandered into flames while on watch. Winter births were survival lotteries. Normandy baptismal registers show February babies died at twice the rate of August's. Those who lived developed eerie resilience. Their smaller extremities adapted to cold faster. Their lungs grew tolerant of smoke. Swiss researchers examining medieval child skeletons found winter-born individuals had denser bone growth around nasal passages, likely from constant inhalation of frigid air. Psychological hardening began at weaning. Parents intentionally withheld comfort to prevent softness, letting children cry themselves silent to conserve energy. Grandmothers told purposely terrifying stories while inspecting kids for frostbite, conditioning them to endure pain without fuss. Some alpine villages staged cold tests, where 7-year-olds spent nights in unheated outbuildings with just a wool sack. About 30% didn't survive these initiations, recorded as winter accidents. The lucky ones adapted. By adolescence, they could sleep standing up when floors were overcrowded, wake precisely at 2-hour intervals, and identify edible bark by moonlight. Their fingers moved confidently in pitch blackness, weaving nets or carving spoons without sight. Some developed permanent squints from years of peering through smoke-filled rooms. Amazingly, joy still flickered. Icelandic children played fire writing, quickly sketching shapes with burning sticks before the embers died. Russian toddlers had snow mice, bits of fat on string dragged across frozen floors to amuse babies. But even these games served purposes, building fine motor control for mending or training eyes to track movement in darkness. Happiness was never the point. Resilience was. These children became adults who notoriously outworked modern laborers, endured pain that would hospitalize us, and survived conditions we'd call uninhabitable. Archaeological evidence shows their bones often healed multiple fractures without medical care, their teeth worn down from chewing frozen food when fires failed. What we call child abuse was their basic training, because winter didn't care how old you were when it killed you. And the village watched it all happen. Every cough, every frozen toe, every tiny corpse carried to church at dawn. Because in medieval winters, your neighbor's survival impacted yours, and letting someone's child die today might mean nobody checks on your family tomorrow. Your survival in a medieval village depended on neighbors noticing your chimney smoke stopped. The watch system wasn't just about crime. It was a web of mutual dependence thicker than blood. Forget privacy. If your fire died unnoticed, so might you. Every able-bodied villager took turns on night patrol, rotating through shifts with military precision. The young and strong walked the perimeter, their footsteps crunching deliberately loud to deter wolves. Elders monitored chimney patterns from central watch huts, noting whose smoke thinned suspiciously early. Teens were stationed at crossroads with horn bells to sound alarms. Missing your assigned watch brought consequences worse than any lord's punishment. Your family might find themselves last in line for help when their own crisis came. The rules were simple but brutal. 3 clear horn blasts meant fire. 2 short, 1 long signaled wolves. A continuous bell toll marked death. Sussex Manor records list fines for households that misinterpreted these codes, like the family who sounded a false wolf alarm because their teenager mistook a wandering drunk for a predator. The village paid for such mistakes and lost sleep and lowered trust. Chimney watching was both science and art. Experienced sentries could judge a family's health by their smoke's consistency. Thin gray wisps at midnight meant controlled burning, probably just simmering porridge. Sudden black billows suggested someone had thrown green wood on in desperation. No smoke after curfew implied either misfortune or arrogance. Both required investigation. Yorkshire court rolls mention a case where watchmen broke down a door to find the residents huddled over a corpse. They'd burned their last chair rather than call for help prematurely. The night patrol's secondary duty, checking for abandoned homes. When the plague hit, some villages established knock protocols, 3 raps on each door before dawn. No answer meant entering to confirm deaths before wild animals beat them to it. French tax records show entire hamlets where watchmen became temporary grave diggers, hauling frozen families to churchyards between shifts. Winter burglaries carried extreme penalties because stealing warmth was tantamount to murder. A thief who took firewood might lose a hand. Those caught looting empty homes were often sealed inside them. Bolton Priory's accounts describe locking a poacher in a derelict cottage until spring to let winter judge him. The few surviving burglars' confessions mention unbearable guilt, not for theft, but for hearing nearby families cough through walls while they enjoyed stolen warmth. The social contract demanded total participation. Refusing watch duty meant exile from communal protections. No borrowing embers when your fire died. No help dragging frozen livestock to market. Alpine villages had snow marks, special patterns cut into drifts to identify outcasts' homes. Welsh poetry describes pariahs watching their own smoke, meaning they lived or died unseen. Yet cooperation bred strange intimacies. Neighbors knew who snored, which couples quarreled after midnight, whose children cried with hunger pains. Somerset court records show disputes over watch shift trades that reveal unexpected alliances. The miller taking the blacksmith's freezing midnight shift in exchange for repaired tools. Everyone owed someone, and everyone collected. The watches also became informal welfare checks. Patrols delivered leftovers to struggling families under guise of inspections. Elders used chimney observations to allocate surplus firewood discreetly. In Swedish towns, the night bell ringer would pause extra long at certain homes, a silent signal for neighbors to check on widows at dawn. The system's true test came during blizzards. Then patrols strung ropes between houses so no one got lost in whiteouts. Watchmen's calls doubled as weather reports, their voices strain indicating wind direction and temperature drops. Some Norwegian villages developed snow codes, stomping specific patterns to guide rescuers to buried homes. Rich or poor, all relied on this network. Manor houses had their own systems. Servants slept in shifts to monitor noble families' breathing. But peasants' survival depended on interdependence. Castle dwellers merely mimicked it. Lincolnshire tax records show wealthier households paying watch fines to avoid patrol duty, while laborers traded extra shifts for food. The watch's legacy lingers in odd places. Modern neighborhood watches descend from these winter patrols. That check on elderly neighbors in cold weather PSA, direct lineage. Even our term, watch night, originates from villagers staying awake together on winter solstice. All this communal effort held one dark truth: solitude killed faster than any disease. Church records overflow with found alone deaths, farmers who failed to join watch rotations, then froze where they fell. A Durham chronicle describes tracking a missing shepherd by following his footprints until they simply stopped mid-stride. Yet somehow, amid this grim vigilance, villagers still found moments to celebrate. The same watchmen who enforced survival rules also smuggled ale to secret midwinter gatherings. They'd turn blind eyes to curfew breaches when youths met sweethearts by starlight. Because even in the longest nights, people remained stubbornly human. And after months of this exhausting vigilance, dawn's arrival brought no relief, just the same brutal cycle in daylight. The watch might have ended, but winter's demands never did. The sweetness of honeyed ale after months of gruel should have been a crime. That first sip clung to your tongue like liquid gold, a taste so shockingly rich it made your teeth ache. Families hoarded these luxuries. A wedge of hard cheese wrapped in waxed cloth since autumn, a handful of raisins smuggled from market. The feast might only happen once all winter, but people talked about it in code for weeks beforehand. Has the black jar been opened? Meant someone had cracked their precious fermented preserves. Music happened whether instruments existed or not. A comb wrapped in parchment became a crude kazoo. A dried gourd filled with pebbles turned into a rhythm keeper. Someone always knew how to play the bladder pipe. An actual inflated pig bladder stretched over reeds that sounded like a goose being strangled. The Germans had nail fiddles, wooden boards with carefully spaced nails that produced different tones when scraped with a stick. People danced anyway, shuffling in circles near the fire until their frozen toes regained feeling. Courtship rituals flourished in the shadows. Young couples met near the bakehouse vents where residual warmth lingered. The approved chaperone was usually a half-blind grandmother, pretending not to notice stolen kisses. Breton villages practiced bundling, allowing sweethearts to share a bed fully clothed with a plank between them. Many winter weddings happened simply because the long nights provided the only privacy for romance. Parish registers show a suspicious spike in March births. Midwinter meant temporary role reversals. The poorest families might appoint a king of misrule for an evening, some toothless grandfather suddenly in charge of doling out extra spoonfuls of pottage. Servants got to sit by the hearth while masters tended the fire. One Swiss chronicle describes a serf's daughter wearing the lady's fur-lined gloves for exactly one night before returning to rags at dawn. Games got creative with limited resources. Shadow puppetry wasn't child's play. It was serious storytelling competition using only hands and firelight. Dice carved from frozen turnips determined who got the last scrap of bacon. Children played find the pea under 3 identical lumps of snow. The prize, the pea itself, boiled immediately in melted snow. Alcohol smoothed everything over. Weak, small beer was standard, but winter reserves included throat-scorching brews. Polish villagers drank snake wine with actual vipers pickled inside for potency. Mead makers tossed in cloves or ginger when they could get it. The intoxication wasn't the point. The illusion of warmth was. You drink until your face flushed, momentarily forgetting your feet were numb. Some pleasures were purely sensory. Brushing fingertips across precious stored apples, memorizing their curves like sculpture. The medicinal herbs hung to dry overhead released sudden bursts of mint or thyme when bumped. Wool freshly taken from storage smelled faintly of summer sheep pastures for about 5 minutes before absorbing the room's smoke stench. Storytelling shifted from warnings to wonder during these respites. Tales of spring's return took center stage, elaborate descriptions of green grass and unfrozen streams that listeners could almost taste. Elders timed these performances carefully. Too early and people resented the tease, too late and despair set in. The best storytellers could make you smell cherry blossoms in the dead of February. Children experienced fleeting magic. Parents staged visits from St. Nicholas weeks after his feast day, because that's when nuts finally became affordable. Birch twigs became dolls when wrapped with yarn scraps. Snow itself was a toy. Scottish kids played Burn the Witch by focusing sunlight through ice lenses onto straw figures. The psychological lifeline was knowing others shared your misery. Collective laughter at someone's impression of the Lord's snoring somehow made the hunger pangs fade. Passing a single cup of ale around so everyone got just enough to wet their lips created camaraderie no feast could match. These weren't frivolities, they were psychological life rafts. A Cheshire proverb said, "A merry night makes a bearable morn." The morning after grogginess mattered less than having something to remember during next week's gruel breakfast. People willingly faced next-day exhaustion because those brief hours of laughter kept them from losing the will to feed the fire one more night. And as dawn approached, the mood shifted subtly. The remaining ale was carefully recorked. Instruments vanished back into rafters where they wouldn't tempt lazy hands during work hours. Lovers untangled fingers reluctantly. Every glance at the fire carried the same unspoken thought. How many sticks remained to get through until the next moment of relief? Because tomorrow wasn't just another day. It was another long march toward survival. Dawn in a medieval village didn't greet you with birdsong. It kicked you awake with ice crystals forming on your eyelashes. That first agonizing stretch revealed limbs stiff as firewood, joints grinding like unlubricated mill gears. Your breath hung in the air even indoors, a visible reminder that surviving the night was only half the battle. Now you had to move. Breakfast was a cruel joke. The pot left simmering overnight had inevitably frozen solid, requiring chipping at it with a knife already numb from cold. Swedish kitchen middens show broken pottery shards with distinct scrape marks, evidence of generations hacking at frozen gruel. The lucky families had metal cauldrons they could place directly in the embers, but that risked burning the precious last meal. Most made do with wooden bowls that warped and cracked from alternating heat and frost. Morning chores became exercises in pain management. Thawing the water bucket meant smashing through inch-thick ice with whatever tool wasn't frozen to the wall. German estate records list frequent axe injuries occurring before sunrise, hands too stiff to grip properly. The well rope would be stiff as iron, forcing families to melt snow in their mouths for the first sip of water. Every movement felt like dragging stones chained to your ankles. Fields didn't wait for warm fingers. Winters meant maintenance. Ditch clearing, tool repair, livestock checks, all performed with hands that barely worked. English court rolls describe fatal accidents from simple tasks. A man crushed under his own plow when frost-numbed fingers slipped the harness. A woman who drowned in 3 feet of water because she couldn't feel herself falling in. The cold made fools of skilled laborers. Essex tax records show crop yields dropping in parishes where winter work injuries were common. The sounds of mourning were a symphony of suffering. Coughs ricocheted across frozen fields as lungs protested the abrupt temperature change. Carts creaked like tortured spirits under loads made heavier by frost. Worst was the metallic ping of tools shattering. Cast iron becomes brittle below freezing, costing families precious equipment with one misplaced strike. You learn to recognize the different sickles death rattles by ear. Animals suffered alongside humans. Cows bawled as udders cracked in the cold. Chickens pecked bloody holes in their own feet when frozen perches stuck to flesh. Sheepdogs curled into tight balls, whimpering until someone poured warmed water between their paw pads. Stable boys in Norse settlements slept nose to flank with horses, stealing warmth while preventing the animals from lying down and freezing to the ground. The psychological toll manifested in strange ways. Sleep-deprived minds struggled with simple tasks. A Kentish farmer's diary records sowing an entire field with rotten seed because he forgot checking it first. Some developed winter speech, slurred words from facial muscles stiff with cold that never fully relaxed. Children forgot words entirely until warmed by midday, their thoughts moving as slowly as sap in frozen trees. Medical knowledge failed against winter's assault. Bloodletting, the era's cure-all, proved deadly when patients couldn't stop shivering long enough for wounds to clot. Herbal remedies froze solid in their pots. Even straightforward frostbite treatment often backfired. Rubbing snow on affected areas only worsened tissue damage. A Frankish physician's journal laments watching an entire family lose fingers after following his own advice. The cumulative effect shortened lives dramatically. Skeletons from medieval burial sites show telltale Harris lines, bone growth interruptions marking severe seasonal stress. Dental analyses reveal dark bands in tooth enamel where malnutrition and cold stunted development yearly. Some Scandinavian graves contain winter coins, bodies buried with an extra layer of shrouds, indicating deaths during cold months when gravediggers worked faster. Yet people persevered through sheer stubbornness. That same farmer who sowed rotten seed would replant in spring. The blacksmith whose tools shattered would painstakingly forge new ones from scavenged metal. Children who lost toes to frostbite adapted their gaits. Every morning's misery was simply the price of living, a tax collected in stiffness, hunger, and exhaustion rather than coin. And as you finally limped toward midday, hands barely functional but tasks completed, one thought nagged. Night would come again all too soon. The fire would need feeding, the water thawing, the family positioned just so around the hearth. Survival wasn't a single victory, but a grinding repetition of uncomfortable dawns and endless nights, until spring grudgingly appeared. Our modern complaints about winter would earn nothing but bitter laughs from these ancestors. Next time your heater clicks on automatically, remember those who measured survival in ember-fed breaths and willpower alone. The cold hasn't changed, only our ability to withstand it has. That blue glow from your smartphone screen would have gotten you burned at the stake in 1423. Not because it's technology, but because you're wasting precious darkness that medieval peasants would have killed for. Their winter nights were about survival. Ours are about binge watching. The difference says more about progress than we might like to admit. Your body doesn't even experience night the same way anymore. Medieval peasants slept in segmented bursts, awake for an hour or two at midnight tending fires, then drifting back down. Modern sleep studies show this biphasic pattern is actually more natural, but your electric-lit nights have trained you to conk out for 8 straight hours. The trade-off: they woke refreshed from 4 hours of deep sleep. You groan awake after 8 hours of half-assed rest. Walk a medieval peasant into your bedroom, and they'd think they died and gone to heaven. The mattress alone would blow their mind. No lice, no straw poking through, no relatives crowding in. That thermostat on the wall, literal magic. They'd weep at the thought of adjustable central heating after generations of huddling around smoking hearths. But show them your medicine cabinet, and the illusion cracks. That bottle of melatonin gummies looks pathetic next to their arsenal of poppy tinctures and valerian roots that actually worked. Physically, we've gotten weaker in all the wrong ways. Your ancestors could survive on 4 hours of fractured sleep because their bodies adapted to winter's demands. Your circadian rhythm collapses if your Wi-Fi cuts out. They developed night vision sharp enough to spot wolves at 200 paces. You stub your toe walking to a bathroom with night lights. Their hands repaired fishing nets by touch in pitch black. You can't even find your phone without a flashlight app. The social differences sting worse. Medieval villages had forced intimacy. You knew your neighbor's coughs and children's nightmares because you slept 12 to a room. Modern suburbs have walls so thick you might not notice someone dying next door. Studies show pre-industrial communities had lower rates of depression despite their harsh lives. Turns out constant companionship beats Instagram likes for mental health, even if that companionship smells like unwashed feet and pickled herring. There's a cruel irony in how we've traded one set of problems for another. They froze together in dark rooms. We sit alone in climate-controlled apartments staring at screens. Their winter nights forged unbreakable community bonds. Hours spawn endless threads about loneliness epidemics. The very technologies that freed us from darkness may have cut us off from something vital, the human warmth that made winter survivable. Their survival strategies live on in distorted forms. That weighted blanket you splurged on, a pale imitation of the 5 relatives who used to sleep on top of you for warmth. Your sound machines, crackling fire setting. A sad echo of hearths that actually kept people alive. Even your curated Spotify sleep playlists mimic the rhythmic chants medieval families used to calm frightened children during storms. The physical remnants still surface in odd places. DNA studies show Europeans carry genetic adaptations to cold from these brutal winters. Better circulation in extremities, elevated pain tolerance. Your ability to function sleep-deprived. That's their legacy too. But we're losing something essential. The grit that comes from facing night's challenges raw rather than swiping them away with apps. Modern life has smoothed out winter's edges, but at a cost. Medieval peasants could handle discomfort because they had no choice. You fall apart when the power blinks out for an hour. Their idea of roughing it was burning furniture to avoid freezing. Yours is when the hotel Wi-Fi is slow. The resilience they built in those long nights kept civilizations alive through famines and plagues. What happens when our first real crisis hits? Certain skills have flipped entirely. They memorized star patterns to track time. You can't navigate without GPS. Their children could start fires at age 5. Yours panicked during power outages. The survival knowledge that got humanity through millennia of winters is evaporating in 2 generations of central heating. Museums now teach primitive fire starting as a novelty rather than a life-saving skill. Funny enough, the Amish, who kept communal winter practices, have half the seasonal depression rates of their modern neighbors. Perhaps the greatest paradox is warmth itself. Medieval bodies burned hotter because they had to. Higher metabolisms from constant shivering and manual labor. Your body barely bothers heating itself properly anymore. Studies show average core temperatures have dropped since the Industrial Revolution. Essentially, we've outsourced our survival to furnaces and electric blankets, leaving our own systems lazy and unprepared. Most ironically, many modern sleep problems stem from lacking the very hardships our ancestors endured. Doctors now prescribe weighted blankets to mimic the pressure of shared beds, light therapy to replace winter's natural rhythms, even vibration pads to simulate the subtle tremors of a cold body conserving heat. We're spending fortunes to artificially recreate conditions that used to be free and unavoidable. The medieval peasants would laugh themselves sick at our inventions. Sleep podcasts. They had grandmothers singing ancient lullabies. White noise machines. Try the actual howl of wind through rafters. Your memory foam mattress. They traded in a heartbeat for a spouse's warm back pressed against theirs on a freezing night. All our technology hasn't made night more comfortable, just more lonely. Yet here's the kicker. Every convenience you enjoy tonight exists because someone survived those brutal winters. That automatic thermostat tracks back to parents who stayed awake stoking fires so their kids wouldn't freeze. Your down comforter descends from generations who slept under flea-infested hay because feathers were precious. Even your right to complain about minor discomforts was earned by people who endured real suffering season after season. The next time you roll over in your cozy bed to check the time on a glowing screen, remember that simple motion would have been someone's wildest fantasy for centuries. Modern life hasn't just changed how we sleep, it's changed what we expect from night itself. Whether that's progress or loss depends on whether you're the one facing a winter storm in a thatched hut or a heated apartment. Either way, night will always come. We've just forgotten how to see in the dark. Those bone-chilling medieval nights shaped our world more than we realize. Everything from your cozy bed to your warm morning shower exists because generations survived winters we can barely imagine. Next time you complain about a cold bedroom, picture an ancestor laughing at you from their lice-infested straw mattress. We've kept their resilience even if we've forgotten where it came from. So tonight when you flip that light switch, spare a thought for the centuries of darkness that came before. Then go ahead and enjoy your heated blanket. You're not soft, you're just living their dream.